Great. Thank you very much for that welcome. So my name is Heather Lawrence. I am Text Manager of Indigenous Affairs based in Vancouver. And I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is to be with you here this morning and to have the opportunity to participate in the inaugural Forward Summit. And I would like to congratulate all the organizers, and in particular Chief Weaselhead and JP Gladue for what is a really impressive event, bringing people together for some really important conversations around empowering Indigenous economies. So we were invited by the Forward Summit to present a panel on relationships between industry and Indigenous communities related to Tech's Frontier project because it was deemed to be notable. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up in the discussion today around what people think is notable. And there certainly are aspects of the work that the Tech team did with Indigenous communities that we're quite proud of, including having concluded 14 out of 14 agreements with First Nations and Métis communities. And of course, there were a number of challenges along the way. It wasn't all perfect. So we have invited some of the members of the Indigenous communities that we worked with to join us here today to speak frankly about our shared experiences and to share what we've learned going through this experience together. So as your moderator for this panel this morning, my job is to facilitate the discussion so that the panel members can tell their stories. So I'm going to stop speaking shortly and allow the panel members to introduce themselves. And I will just give you a quick overview. We're going to have quick introductions. Then we're going to shift to some prepared remarks. We've got some slides to support that. Followed by some discussion amongst the panel, and then my job is to make sure we leave some time at the end, before the end of our session, to allow for questions from the floor. So keep that in mind. There will be an opportunity for you to pose your questions to the panel. So I'm now going to turn it over to Bill Lutted, the CEO of McMurray Métis, to provide a brief introduction to get us started.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, chiefs, distinguished guests. I too am honored to be here to speak on behalf of the relationships we built. My name is Bill Lutted. I'm the CEO of McMurray Métis, and we're just here to provide some insight into how we developed this relationship with Tech.
I'm a lot lazier than Bill, so I'm not getting up. This is way too comfortable. My name's Robin Johnston. I'm General Manager of Community and Indigenous Affairs for Tech Resources. I've been working in the mining industry in Alberta, the Northwest Territories and British Columbia for about 20 years, and I'm responsible for Indigenous relationships for our energy business unit.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Treaty 7 for allowing me to visit your beautiful territory. My name is Melody Lapine, and I'm a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. I'm from the north shore of a small little community called Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, northeastern Alberta. I'm also a Cree and Dene and a little bit of Métis in me as well, Bill. And I've been the director for the government and industry relations for the Mikisew Cree for about 15 years now. So I run a small department. Our office is in Fort McMurray, and I'm really responsible for interacting with all of the developers in our region, primarily industry, and do some work with government as well in regards to policy and legislation and basically all the regulatory requirements in managing the oil sands up in our region. Happy to be here as well.
Good morning. Robin Sidsworth, very happy to be here in Treaty 7. And thank you so much for the warm welcome this morning. I'm corporate counsel with TEC, and my primary responsibility is working on our agreements with the Indigenous communities. So that's what I spend most of my time doing, is working with Heather, Robin, and others in similar roles at different sites throughout the organization. And I have the very great pleasure of working closely with people like Bill and Melody on our agreements, Frontier and otherwise.
Great, thanks everyone. So we're now going to move through a couple of slide presentations, and I have the distinct honor of being in charge of the clicker. So I think we'll launch in, and let's see how we do here. All right.
Great. So I'll kick off and on to the next slide, Heather. So TEC is Canada's oldest diversified mining company. We produce materials that all of us use in our daily life. So your vehicle is, chances are the frame of it is coated with zinc. So we mine zinc. Some of you may be taking zinc lozenges because of cold and flu season as well. Copper is obviously used for everything from this microphone to wiring in your house. As the chief previously mentioned, we all use steel-making coal, from the steel frame of this chair to the building. And the other area that we produce is energy. So we're part owners with Suncor on the Fort Hills oil sands project, and we're in the process of permitting the Frontier oil sands project. We mine in the Americas, so Alaska, South America, Canada. You know, TEC's got a long history and has mined throughout Canada. Chances are, if you own RSPs somewhere in your RSP portfolio, you're likely to have TEC resources. So I work for you. Any complaints, come and see me. Great. I think it's important to know how we frame out how we work with Indigenous peoples. And really, I really encourage you to go to our website, tec.com, and you will see really how we frame that out. And we frame it in terms of an approach to sustainability, and our work is also really guided by an Indigenous peoples policy. And I think it's a very important thing for any company to really frame out how they will work with Indigenous communities. In our case, we've made a commitment to work to achieve free, prior, informed consent, and we think that that's a really pivotal part of allowing us to engage in an appropriate manner. The slide is a little out of date. We have about 66 agreements presently in place with communities from Alberta, Alaska, Chile, Peru. And I think I'll hand it over to Robin.
Great. I can't totally see the slides, but that's fine. I'm happy to just go off script. So I think this is an overview of the Frontier project. So you can see its location, which is between Fort McKay and Fort Chipewyan. It's a very large project, right, about 260, 270,000 barrels a day. And maybe what I'd highlight really is its proximity to Wood Buffalo National Park, which you can see towards the top of the map there in the light green, as well as the Birch Mountains on the west. So although Melody could speak to this much better than I can, Frontier is in, oh, look at that, so kind, is in a really critical location in terms of traditional land use for a number of communities, including Mikisew, Cree, Athabasca, Chipewyan, and Métis communities. So There's important wildlife habitat, water access, and all those fun complexities that make projects like this both interesting and challenging. So this is just a quick overview of where we are in the sort of process of advancing this project, which we thought was useful because, of course, as lots of people here will know, as you advance a project, and particularly as you go through regulatory work, you tend to advance your relationships with Indigenous communities similarly. So right now, you can see that we're at a joint review panel stage. So we had a hearing in the fall, and the joint review panel is deliberating on those proceedings, and we're hoping for a report, I believe, in early Q3. And you can see the timelines there, right? We initially started back in 2011, and so it's been a bit of a journey, although a pretty significant update to the project in 2015. So there's been a long ish, depending on your perspective, history on this project of working with Indigenous communities. And that's led us here, where we now have 14 agreements in place at Frontier. And you can see that that's really communities both north and south, and east and west of the project. A project of this scale obviously has the potential to touch on lots of different communities in very different and unique ways for each of them. So I won't read that list out to you, but I will say that this list expanded, changed as we advanced the project and as we went through our consultation with Indigenous communities, and as they educated us on their communities, their interests, their rights. And so when we first started in 2011, and I was with Tech at that time, our understanding of what we were likely to do on agreements with Indigenous peoples looked a lot different than where we ultimately ended up.
Not taking questions now.
Okay, just a little history on McMurray Métis. We were been founded back in 1987, although our Métis have been up there long before Canada. We have a proven 32-year success record. We're a strong, stable organization, and we're Indigenous people under the Canadian Constitution. Our membership has been growing rapidly. There's over 800 Métis cardholders in Fort McMurray, and we have just over 500 of them signed up now. Go to the next slide. Of course, as you notice, there's, out of all those agreements, there's 10 Métis organizations, which is quite surprising in that we don't have a consultation policy, and that was where Tech has come to the front. They realize that statement of concerns go in, so they're better off to consult early. And they've done a great job at getting everybody on side. Slide 3. Our community is very much made up of elders, youth, and we have quite a membership that work within the oil patch right now. And we're very fortunate in that after 40 years, we have members that are retiring from the companies, and they're coming back to the Métis community and helping us with our governance and business. We run fairly a lot of different events over the year, and we continue to make sure that we follow our culture, and we have a Métis festival which is very huge up there, and golf tournament, which we raise money for our secondary students going into secondary, which is very important. And this is where we've actually been able to lead in that industry is very favorable to support these type of events. And the other part is our business side. So we do have our Infinity group of companies. Actually, we have our COO here today, Ron Sturgis. So if there's an opportunity to sit down and talk to him, that's very important. We've also been working on the next slide, the Métis consultation policy, which has been very troubling in that we're getting close to the end of the government's term. They're going to go into election, and we still don't have that Métis consultation policy. But through our work with industry, you know, we've realized that building these relationships is very important. And in order to have a good relationship, there's got to be that trust. And, you know, it takes a long time to build that. And that's why you require that consultation up early so that you're able to build these relationships and work out a lot of the issues that, you know, we've seen in the past. So we really think Teck is a leader. They didn't have to consult with us, but they did. And they have a real strong team that we're able to listen to our concerns. And, you know, they are a model for other companies, and there are other companies out there that we have long-term agreements with, and some of them are here in the room today, and we're very proud of those relationships and agreements that we have. With that, I'll let you pass on to Mikisew.
Okay, next slide, Heather, please. I'll just stay seating if that's okay. So the Mikisew Cree First Nation, so we're a part of Treaty 8 and considered one of the largest First Nations in the Athabasca region. We have about 3,000 members, sort of all scattered throughout our region. Primarily our home is Fort Chipewyan, where a lot of our reserves are located. But there's a huge amount of us also living in Fort McMurray, really taking advantage of the development there and working there. We have members in Edmonton and Fort Smith, Northwest Territories as well. The next slide will explain a little bit of where the heart of our community really is we consider our people from the Delta. The Peace Athabasca Delta is one of the world's largest freshwater deltas. And we really have a strong traditional economy still relying on the exercise of our Aboriginal treaty rights. A lot of harvesting happens within the Delta, a lot of fishing, hunting, and access to some of these areas is becoming more challenging, as you can see in the photo. That's a picture in Lake Claire. So we've primarily downstream from a lot of the projects, including the Frontier Project. And really, I think some of the biggest challenges right now are just the ability to exercise our treaty rights. The next slide. This is a map just to kind of show you, how big Treaty 8 is. And in northeastern Alberta, the sort of the black shaded area is what we kind of consider our consultation area. So we've done numerous Indigenous knowledge and traditional land use studies and sort of outline almost over 30,000 sort of sites of use within the territory. So what we've done with a lot of the mapping exercises that we've done is sort of just laid out through the black shaded area, just kind of where Mikisew people are going out to try to harvest and basically occupy their traditional territory. So we focus a lot of our consultation within that black shaded area. Not to say that projects only have to happen within that area. We're also looking at a lot of projects that are outside of the area. For example, BC Hydro Site C project is upstream from the Peace River in British Columbia, but it has significant effects downstream within the Peace Athabasca Delta. So those are examples of projects that we look at outside of our consultation area. So a little bit about the department that I manage. We were created in 2002. I think a number of, we used to be all called IRCs back then, Industry Relations Corporations, and we all sort of were born out of the All Parties Core Agreement under ATC. So out of the 5 nations, we started around the same time, and we're basically a department under the First Nation that interacts with the industry primarily on all of the resource development. So we manage all of the consultation, everything from the regulatory aspects to negotiating impact benefit agreements, and play also a key role in ensuring that our other arm, which is the group of companies, Mikisew has a fairly strong number of different corporations that they partnered with, so we interact with them as well, and they're involved in a lot of our negotiations. This is sort of just a summary of the mandate and sort of what the community has instructed us to do in working with industry, is to really seek to minimize the impacts, primarily the environmental and social impacts that as a result of the intensity of development in the region. At the same time, trying to maximize as much benefits and opportunities as we can. So some of the challenges in our region, I think many of you are aware of this, just the intensity and the pace and scale of development. A lot of the image there is really showing primarily oil sands development, so there's not a lot of agriculture, there's not a lot of huge urban development, but a lot of it is really focused on oil sands. And for every major oil sands project, whether it's a mine or an in situ SAGD project, it really brings a number of different types of ancillary projects, things like camps, roads, utility lines, pipelines, and all of that. So I think the image really just shows just how much disturbance and activity there is in our region. So, on the other side of, trying to manage the impacts with development, we also look at the opportunities. And so a lot of those opportunities and managing those impacts come through these impact benefit agreements. And so when we look at a lot of the negotiations that we've done, and I've been involved in a few of those negotiations, I think we're really thinking big, thinking outside the box. And I know many of you are aware of, the East Tank Farm deal that we've done with Suncor in Fort McKay. So those are the things that I think when you start to look at a lot of projects, is you got to really think outside the box and think big. How are you going to really maximize the benefits from these projects? As well as Robin spoke about just consent, free, prior, informed consent, and ensuring that reconciliation is really the core of the consultation. And I forgot the last couple of things there. If you've asked me about 10, 12 years ago when I started to look at the terms of reference for the proposed Frontier project, if Mikisew was going to ever sign an agreement, I probably would have laughed and said, absolutely not, just given, the proximity of the project, the impacts to, our delta and everything, the Ronald Lake bison herd there. But, I think in 10 years, it's, a decade, it's a long time in working with Teck. So a lot of that has been about establishing trust and confidence in working with a company such as Teck. And the last thing I think is an important thing is that our agreement with Teck is really not about getting government off the hook, as we still hold government completely accountable and responsible for consultation and most especially accommodation. Robin spoke about, the government is to make a decision about this project in the next few months, but we are still pressuring the government about accommodation and really dealing with the impacts of this project among many other projects in the region in terms of dealing with government-related matters such as cumulative effects, species at risk, treaty and Aboriginal rights. Those are things that we don't look to companies like Teck to have to mitigate and deal with. Those are really ultimately the responsibility of the government. With that, I will close.
All right. Thanks, everyone. So Bill and Melody, I'm wondering if you can start us off by telling us about how your communities have benefited from development in the oil sands, including how you ensure appropriate mitigation happens, and that your community shares in the benefits of resource extraction.
Do you want me to go first? Okay. So many of our agreements, I think a lot of those are done through agreements. So, you know, it's very important to have these commitments made by industry through legally binding agreements. Some of these projects are going to go for 50, 60 years. And so there's going to be changes in the community. There's going to be changes with people at Teck. And so having things laid out, I think, and sort of prescribe to you how is that relationship going to, you know, evolve over the lifetime of a project is really sort of the reasons why we have these agreements. And so the agreements really speak about trying to maximize those opportunities, Heather, in regards to contracting opportunities, having a role in terms of managing the environmental impacts, things like reclamation standards with them, incorporating Indigenous knowledge, Mikisew knowledge in monitoring. And so I think those are all the opportunities that I see coming from development.
Great, thank you. Bill?
Yeah, similarly, the McMurray Métis have done similar agreements, some long-term, and we've looked at it more in trying to push our economic opportunities just so that we can be sustainable. And we probably have one of the highest rates of Aboriginal grads up in the north, in the Fort McMurray area. And we're very concerned about our youth and making sure they have meaningful work. So that's where a lot of our attention is focused right now. We're looking at more of the higher end trades, and of course we try and push them into post-secondary. But you know, the trades are another important part for the Métis, in that Métis have always been the workers on the land right from the early days of freighting in that area. And you know, we've looking to continue taking advantage of the opportunities that are there, not only for our youth, but also the elders are very important to us, because they're the ones that can transfer a lot of the cultural knowledge to our youth. So many of our events are staged to ensure that both are together. And like Melody says, this is a 50-year project, and over the course of 50 years, we're going to see a few generations that benefit from these agreements.
Now, Bill, I understand that you have publicly stated you will not cut your hair until the province of Alberta respects Métis rights. Given the inconsistent approach to consultation by the federal and provincial governments, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what this means for you as a leader of your community.
Well, like I said, the Métis are also very innovative, and although there's no consultation policy, you know, we really look towards the First Nations, how they built up their regulatory team. And we're very fortunate. We'll actually go out and steal some of their workers to, you know, help us in that area, and we've done that. Of course, the consultation policies they started working on way back in the early 2000s. You know, we're really thinking that this was going to be great, and we tried working with the government on it, and it seemed that they were kind of standoffish, but, you know, they said, don't worry, Bill, the Aboriginal consultation policy's coming. So it was about 2007, I think, that it was brought in. Mel?
First Nation policy?
Yeah.
I believe it was right after or right before the Mikisew decision, actually. That was 2005.
2005. Anyways, so I went down to River Cree when they announced it, and you know, all the way along they said it was an Aboriginal consultation policy, but, you know, right into the first couple sentences it was definitely First Nation, and we got left out of it. So you know, we fought. They continued to say they were bringing a Métis consultation policy, and they did. They brought a Métis settlement policy. So this has always been a real concern for the Métis in that, you know, if you're not consulted up front, you end up, in the end, having to take them to a hearing. That really creates a lot of problem because then you're adversarial with that company for a long time, and it's very hard to bring your companies into that condition. And so, yes, it's been very difficult. We spent a lot of time here in this last couple years with the NDP thinking that there was going to be a policy, and I guess there's still an opportunity that it may come to pass, but I'll probably have to go a few more years with this before I cut my hair.
I have a question for perhaps one of the tech Robins. Given that I guess some companies choose to do what's right versus meeting those minimum government requirements, I'm wondering if one of you could share your thoughts on the business case for doing the right thing.
I think it's really important for a company and also for an Indigenous community to understand the company's approach. But I think there's a real opportunity around starting off that you are going to take a values-based approach to your relationships. Ultimately, relationships have to be based on trust. So it's the underlying value of how you choose to engage that's really important. If you take a values-based approach, I think that absolutely leads you to, you need to consult, and you need to consult with potentially a very broad range of people, and you need to develop a relationship with them, and you've got to put time into that. I think some companies take really a risk-based approach that will say, well, what's going to happen if we don't enter into a relationship? And how is that going to impact our project? I would actually advocate that there is a business case for consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities being a core competency of a company. And I think that we see that there are scheduled benefits to a project for those of you that are responsible for major projects in the audience. We think that it plays out that there are scheduled benefits for projects when you take a values-based approach. I don't know if you want to add to that, Robin.
All right, well, I certainly agree, Robin, with your observations, and I think what I would add is that in my experience, the business case is often articulated as risk mitigation or schedule management or reputational management. And while I think those are important considerations, obviously, for any company, I've definitely seen just how much better you can build a project with the right kind of Indigenous input. You achieve better and different results on environmental management, on impacts management, and you leave a different kind of a legacy. You have a different project when you have the right kind of relationships with Indigenous peoples, and a project with the right kind of relationships is a project that it's better. It's not just that you've shaved some time off your schedule. I think you actually end up with a project that is more robust overall, will leave more positive legacies, and ultimately, whether it's in the oil sands or in any resource development, or certainly at Teck, I think we recognize that our definition of success, and communities may differ slightly, but your Indigenous communities and others will define whether you have been successful. And so you can't leave those relationships to the side.
Great, thank you. Bill and Melody, I'm wondering if you can speak to the approach that your communities take to the negotiation process. Melody, maybe start with you.
Well, I think just going back to sort of the mandate that we've been asked to do on behalf of our community is really just explore the opportunities that the proposed project will bring, as well as investing a lot of time and effort in understanding those potential impacts. So I think those strong environmental assessments and participating in rigorous technical reviews. We have a team of a number of different experts from not only our elders and land users, but also biologists and groundwater experts, surface quality experts. So thoroughly analyzing the applications to bring forward technical concerns, community concerns, and ensuring that those are well defined and put forward to the company so that they understand what concerns and what impacts their proposed project will bring. Because really it is working through a number of those concerns and impacts that really is going to lead to potential consent of a project, as well as the opportunities of the project. So what types of contracts, for example, the Frontier project is going to, is proposing a new bridge across the Athabasca River. So there will bring a lot of contracting opportunities there for Mikisew businesses. Employment and training opportunities. There's going to be probably thousands of workers required during the construction phase of the project. So we look at trying to maximize, ensuring that we're keeping up with the training aspects to ensure that we're maximizing, again, those employment opportunities as best we can. So those things are all really laid out in the negotiations mandate. We include sometimes a member of our leadership, our business team, our technical team, which is primarily the team that I work with, and really the negotiations in this case was a number of years. It took a long time, and it really was about ensuring that we're really clear on what our objectives and what outcomes we wanted to achieve in our negotiations, and being really focused on that.
Great, thank you, Melody. And Bill, how about for the McMurray Métis community? What's the approach you take to the negotiation process?
Well, similar to Melody, we believe that you have to have that strong governance. We're fortunate in that we have a president and vice president and board that have been fairly consistent for the last 7 or 8 years, and with that, it's enabled us to focus on building a negotiating team that has experience and are expert in their field. Of course, you got to have the business side, like Melody says, because that's what's going to sustain you over the course of that project. And we do have a business side that it's kind of an arm's length. It has to be, but through that you hire the right people, and they go out and look for those joint ventures that will complement the membership. Of course, you got to have a strong legal team also, and of course, Robin. They make sure that all those T's are crossed, and there's no more days of handshake deal. But yeah, it's very important to hire very good people when you're in that negotiation stage, because that's where you're going to be able to sustain yourself over the long term.
Great, thanks, Bill. So the next question is for the full panel. Wondering if you can share an example from either your experience on the Frontier project or elsewhere of a success, something that went well, that you'd like to share here, perhaps as a recommendation for the folks in the audience. Maybe we'll start at the far end with Robin Sidsworth.
Well, there's probably a number of things that I could talk about, but I think one of the things I would highlight that was maybe particular to my role in the negotiations that was a little bit unique for us on Frontier was really the crafting of agreements that were needed to be much more flexible and much more adaptive given the extremely long life of the project, and even the further life of the agreement after that, which is meant to extend into and past active reclamation. So you're talking about agreements that may last, upwards of 80 years. And as the parties grappled with how to do that, we really, I think as a group and as negotiation teams struggled with how do you build adaptable, flexible agreements. And one of the things we realized is that we needed to leave space for disagreement, which I can tell you for me was not super comfortable. Bill talked about crossing T's, dotting I's. Lawyers tend not to like disagreements unresolved, preferably in their preferred fashion. So that was a unique thing for us to work on agreements where we both recognized that there were today some issues that were not fully resolved and that we would need to continue working on those, and that we would have issues like that throughout the relationship. And how would you manage those successfully? How could you ensure that those disputes were managed constructively in a way that advanced your relationship and not set it back? And that was, I think, something particularly unique to these agreements.
I think the interesting thing about this agreement for us is, none of us have a crystal ball. We can't predict, in 50 years what the project really is going to be like and what the lay of the land in our region will look like. So the interesting thing is, we talked about, what those potential impacts could be within the Delta, the heart of our community. And so we discussed, well, if we have in 20 years when, as the mine is going to progress north closer to Wood Buffalo National Park and, start to mine some of the tributaries flowing into our Delta, we managed to arrange like a structured decision making. So as, in 20 years from now, if things are completely different and the impacts are so significant, that we have a process with Teck that will allow Mikisew to sit down with them and say, hey, look at this project is actually much bigger and the impacts are much larger than we expected. We need to reevaluate things. And so a structured decision-making, approach like that in agreements, I think, is very important because none of us know what, our future is really going to look like, especially when you have, additional impacts such as climate change playing a role, for example, in drawing our Delta. So these are, I think, a really important aspect of our agreement and something that is very unique and encourage other communities to look at agreements in that way. Keep it a living document because communities change, priorities change, and impacts definitely change. Thank you.
Yes, similarly, with the McMurray Métis, the one thing we have in common with the First Nation is we're very concerned about the environment. And through these negotiations with Teck, we've been very fortunate in that two of our trappers are right in that zone where the Ronald Lake bison spend all their time, and it's been a lot of fun working with industry because now you got a partner when you're going up to government about how do you protect that area, and it's very important for the First Nations in that like you got Wood Buffalo Park there, but there's still needs to be some type of buffer that keeps development from encroaching too much, and Robin and them worked hard, and they've given up some of their property for this biodiversity zone, which I really felt was really honorable on behalf of Teck. And we're still working on how the monitoring is going to be going, and so yeah, environmental protection is very important. We also, I just wanted to say that some of the other stuff we've had that's been very positive is there's a few of the companies in here today, Imperial and Syncrude, who have worked very closely with us over the last couple of years, and it's been very positive in that respect too.
I think I would echo Melody's comments about the structured decision making, and that was a real step out for us because in essence there is a small part of the project, it's a small pit near the end of mine life, And we heard very clearly from community members about their concerns about potential impacts to a different watershed that has not been previously impacted by oil sands mining. So we took that really seriously, and the one thing, in essence, I mean, this isn't quite it, but in essence, we essentially said, we think that we can mine the North Pit in an environmentally appropriate manner. But we're going to take the first 30 odd years of mine life to actually prove to you that we will do that. We're going to have to put in place upfront monitoring. We're going to have to put in a lot of baseline data, but we're going to enter into the structured decision making. And when it's coming to the end of our mine life and we're having to proceed to mine the North Pit, we're going to go through a process that's going to include a no development option, and we're going to work through that with you. So we're putting our, we're really putting things on the line where we say we will work with you around this for the future.
Great, thank you. And I can see that there are a number of questions starting to come in, which is great. Good to know that people are engaged with the panel. But I did want to give Melody and Bill just a last opportunity by asking you the question framed around, the Frontier project is a very large project. I think it's going to be in operation for something close to 5 decades. So very, very long life, but certainly beyond my tenure at Teck. Do you have any recommendations for Teck as a company in order to support good working relationships with the Indigenous communities over the life of the mine?
Well, now that we got that relationship established, it's something you got to continue to work at too. So I believe that our leadership teams will be meeting with Teck over the course of these years and ensuring that everybody's satisfied with the environmental and the business opportunities, and things will change over time. And if you got the right relationship, you can adjust to those.
Yeah, I think like any relationship, I think investing, clear communication, always keeping each other, I think, in the loop of, what potential changes, concerns, what's going on. And I think, we started that early, I think, with Teck. For example, if we were going to send a strong letter to the minister about a specific issue that might affect the Frontier project, we sort of, hey, just to expect it, Mikisew is going to be doing this, and likewise, Teck would do the same with us. So I think just having, again, that trust and, communication very open, as well as bringing, I think, concerns early. Like, you don't want things to manifest and build and become, a big snowball of issues that are it's going to be very complicated to undo all of that. So I think one of the things that we learned along the way is just being very direct and very forward and bringing, concerns very early from the community, whatever they may be. As well as, I mentioned people, I may not be managing the consultation on the Frontier project for that long. So, there may be new people. So I think transitioning, I think that evolution over time is important, that we're laying a little bit of a foundation so that new people that are replacing us can ensure that there's that consistency and continuity in building and investing in that relationship. I think is fairly important. In my role, I've seen numerous changes with industry, with different people. You work, now you're with this company, so there's always changes, and I think it's a lot of times I look to the company as being responsible for the relationship with the community. I say, I'll help you, I'll facilitate that with you, but it's not my responsibility for how that relationship gets defined. It's the responsibility on the company, and that's really different with every company, really. But you can see how much some companies invest more than others, and that really allows for those companies to have a more, I think, fruitful and productive relationship with the community.
Great, thank you both. We'll make sure that advice goes in the briefing note. So we're now going to shift to some questions that have come in from the audience. And Melody, it looks like the top question is a question for you. Oh, and they do show up on the screen. Good. So Melody, you said 10 years ago you didn't think the Frontier Project would ever be accepted by Mikisew Cree First Nation. What was the turning point where this thinking changed?
I spoke a little bit about the importance of, environmental assessments, making sure that, a number of these projects are assessed the right way and looking at impacts. So, we pushed really hard to ensuring, the project would allow for looking at impacts in the Wood Buffalo National Park. So that gave us a lot more confidence once, that happened, when the joint review panel issued that. As well as when we raised the concerns about the buffer area, and we really didn't want to see any more projects moving north in around that Teck Frontier area. So Teck took that very seriously. When Mikisew brought that forward, we said we want a buffer zone, we want a protected area in around your project, and they actually supported it. And Robin and I did joint presentations to CAP, to the UNESCO monitoring mission, promoting the biodiversity stewardship area, which now is in the final stages of becoming a reality. We will have a new wildland conservation area just north of the Frontier lease. So we are working closer to, a buffer zone protecting Wood Buffalo National Park and our delta, thanks to companies like Teck for donating their leases and working with us to, gather other companies to come forward to also donate their leases. So those are examples of what's changed along the 10 years, as well as Robin spoke about the structured decision making. We were really at a sticky point when we said, that area north of your project really is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to address that issue? And so again, thinking big, thinking outside the box, came up with a structured decision making through those negotiations. So it takes a lot of thinking, a lot of hard work, but in the end, we did it.
Great, thank you. So I think I'll open up this next question to the full panel. Can you give some examples of how Teck incorporates traditional knowledge in the project design? Robin, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that one. I think two actually come to mind, and both have been discussed in our recent hearing in Fort McMurray. And one was, and it's related to mitigation measures. And Athabasca Chippewa First Nation were very clear on their concerns about caribou. And it was actually somewhat of a disagreement. We didn't hold the same view from a scientific perspective of what we saw the potential impacts to caribou being. And but we essentially said, regardless of that, we're going to make a commitment that we will allocate money that will be spent early in the project life around restoration of linear disturbances. So things like cut lines, and those can have a real impact on caribou mortality due to wolves using them as highways to hunt. So that's one example. The other example would be around our fisheries offsetting. So we impact fisheries habitat. Fisheries Act requires us to put in place measures around mitigation. And one of those things that we're going to be doing is creating a habitat compensation lake as an offset. And what we really heard was, that's great, it's not our preferred method. We're held by DFO to advancing it. But the importance of bison habitat and wetlands and that design of that habitat compensation lake was really important. So we're essentially altering the design of the lake in response to community concerns and interests around bison habitat.
Okay, we'll move along to the next question, which starts with a nice acknowledgement of the panel. And the question is, does procurement strategies differ with such a long-term plan for community engagement?
Well, I'm happy to try and speak to that. So I think the answer is yes, although you know, I suppose it depends in relation to your reference point. But certainly with a project that's this long-lived, when you're trying to talk about what does success look like for procurement, it becomes very challenging because, of course, if you think about 50 years in the past and what would the potential procurement opportunities have been then, or what would the aspirations of Indigenous communities have been then, it looks very different than it is today. And we know that, you know, 50 years from now, we'll be in a similar position, right? The aspirations of communities will be different than they are today. Probably the nature of available contracts and contracting work will vary. And so you really need to try and step quite far back to set, I think, big picture objectives that both parties can feel are compelling, that they can really use to help their own planning processes. And then you have to try, I think, and actually work very closely together on both short and long-term plans, so that hopefully what you're doing is building together so that communities are building businesses that actually support and help the project, which is definitely the case, I think, from what we've seen at some of our other projects. And so that you build a rhythm of, you know, thinking about community capacity, community interests when you're planning and building out your contracting process. And that takes a long-term view, I think, if you want to get to where the parties want to be here, which are very aspirational, very, very big picture outcomes.
Great, thanks, Robin. I want to just check in with the panel members to see, is there a particular question that you would like to speak to as we're getting to the last few minutes left for our panel this morning? Yes, maybe I'm not the only one who finds the writing
I can
small.
tick off the top one very quickly. Look, the Frontier project is designed, we're going to be producing 240,000 barrels a day. We need pipelines for that to proceed. We think it's the appropriate thing from an environmental perspective, and as well as on an economic basis, the economy of moving 240,000 barrels a day does just not work out on rail.
Bill or Melody, is there a question up there you'd like to tackle?
I'd just like to maybe talk about the text plan for the protection of traditional lands. The one thing when industry started in that area, you know, it was always concerned about the environment and what it was going to be like when they're finished. So it's been through a lot of our traditional knowledge committees and that have visited sites that have been reclaimed. You know, you got the Syncrude's bison, and they have numerous lakes and areas that they've turned back over to the government. And with our elders going to these on these trips, you know, they were quite surprised at how things have come back, and you know, so that to me is very important in that you know, we continue to monitor and be involved on the reclamation, so that you know, we're ensuring that future generations have opportunity to be on the land like we've had.
I think I'll just add, we're still at the stage of government reviewing the application and the joint panel to release their decision. We're expecting in July of this year. So I think in terms of a lot of the protection of the traditional lands come in the aspect of what those decisions look like. So we participated in the regulatory hearing in Fort Chippewa, and this was the first regulatory hearing in our region, in our community, again, supported by TEC. So it was actually pretty exciting for us to have our elders present, to have our technical team present, and we made a number of really good, strong recommendations to both the federal and provincial government in those hearings. And so I think a lot of the protection of the traditional lands really comes from both governments really listening to what our recommendations are on the decision for this project. TEC will do what TEC can do within the realities of their project and mitigating their project impacts, but a lot of those protection of traditional lands really fall to the government in terms of what sort of conditions are they going to place, how are they going to protect caribou habitat, how are they going to deal with treaty rights and accommodation. So those are all the issues that are still before both governments, and I think really the answer to that question about how would traditional lands and rights be protected, we're waiting to see actually what the decisions coming forward from both governments.
All right, and I think with that, we're out of time. So I'd like to thank Bill and Melody for joining us this morning to speak about the Frontier Project and your experiences working with TEC, and to thank the Forward Summit for giving us an opportunity to share our experience with you this morning. Thanks very much.